The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Darius's living room, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. He sat hunched over his laptop, the glow of the screen reflecting in his glasses. A frown creased his forehead, not from work, but from the unfamiliar name that had appeared on his network device's list, Crestwood I-01, an unwelcome guest in his digital sanctuary. Darius's fingers hovered over the keyboard, a flicker of unease in his chest. It wasn't paranoia, he told himself. It was simply prudence. In a world where digital footprints were deeper than any in the soil, a little caution went a long way. He'd heard enough stories, enough whispers of data breaches and identity theft, to know that ignoring this would be foolish. A sigh escaped his lips, a puff of air against the quiet hum of the air conditioner. The Wi-Fi signal in his home office, tucked away at the back of the house, had always been temperamental. He'd tried boosters, different router placements, even contacted his internet provider countless times. Perhaps that's why he hadn't noticed the intruder sooner. Now, though, the need to expel this digital interloper gnawed at him. He needed a stronger signal to effect the eviction. Outside, the air hung heavy with the scent of freshly cut grass and the distant drone of a lawnmower. Darius settled onto his porch steps, laptop balanced precariously on his knees. The sunlight warmed his face, a stark contrast to the chill that had settled in his gut. He logged into his router settings, the familiar interface a small comfort in the face of this unknown threat. Crestwood I-01. The name echoed in his mind. Too generic, too close to home. He typed in a new password, a complex string of characters he'd meticulously crafted, each keystroke a small act of defiance against the unseen intruder. A small, bitter smile tugged at his lips. Let them try to crack that. Across the street, Melanie Foster peered through her lace-curtained window, her gaze fixed on Darius hunched over his laptop. The way he kept glancing around, the furtive taps on his keyboard at all seemed so suspicious. She'd never quite trusted Darius. He kept to himself, rarely spoke to anyone, worked from home. What did he do all day? What secrets did he hide behind those drawn curtains? She recalled the neighborhood watch meeting last week, the officer's stern warnings about cybercrime, about staying vigilant. Hadn't he specifically mentioned watching out for unusual activity? Wasn't this unusual? A knot of anxiety tightened in her chest. This was it, she thought. This was the something she'd been waiting for, the something that confirmed all her unspoken suspicions. Darius, oblivious to Melanie's watchful gaze, closed his laptop with a snap, a sense of satisfaction washing over him. The network was secure again. He returned inside, the mundane rhythm of his workday beckoning. He had deadlines to meet, emails to answer, a whole world existing within the confines of his screen, a world he meticulously curated and controlled. He could shut out the noise, the whispers, the intrusions. He could build his own fortress, brick by digital brick. Melanie's hand trembled as she dialed 911. Her voice, usually so crisp and controlled, wavered with a mixture of fear and self-righteousness. "To think something's going on across the street," she stammered, her words tumbling over each other. "My neighbor's been acting strangely. Out on his porch with his computer typing, looking around. I think he's shacking something." A wave of relief washed over her as the dispatcher's calm voice assured her that an officer would be dispatched immediately. She'd done the right thing. She'd protected her neighborhood. She'd been vigilant. The flashing blue and red lights sliced through the quiet afternoon. Detective Louis Navarro stepped out of the patrol car, his partner, Officer Bellcarter, right behind him. Navarro adjusted his tie, a sigh escaping his lips. Another Thursday, another call about suspicious activity. Most of them turned out to be nothing: a squirrel in the attic, a forgotten anniversary, a case of overactive imaginations. He hoped this was one of those. "Mrs. Foster, I presume?" Navarro extended a hand, his expression neutral, his eyes scanning the quiet street. He'd already noted the house across the street, the drawn curtains, the general air of unassuming normalcy. Melanie, flustered but resolute, recounted her observations, her voice laced with a conviction that bordered on hysteria. Navarro listened patiently, his mind already piecing together the fragments of information. He glanced at Carter, a silent question passing between them. Carter's expression was thoughtful, her gaze fixed on the house across the street. Something in her silence, in the subtle furrow of her brow, told Navarro that this might not be as straightforward as it seemed. Inside his home, Darius answered the insistent knocking at his door. He saw the uniforms, the badges, the official expressions, and a knot of unease tightened in his stomach. "Good afternoon, Mr. Coleman," Navarro began, his voice even professional. "We received a call about some suspicious activity. Your neighbor mentioned seeing you outside with your computer, acting strangely." Darius felt a wave of bewilderment wash over him. Strangely? He'd simply changed his Wi-Fi password. He explained this to the officers, his voice calm, his tone measured. He knew he had nothing to hide. As Darius spoke, Carter's gaze drifted towards the corner of the room, where a small, blinking light emanated from a seemingly innocuous device plugged into the wall. It was a familiar sight, one she'd seen before in a recent string of cybercrime cases. A surveillance camera, disguised as a USB charger. Her eyes narrowed. This was more than a simple Wi-Fi password change. Back at the station, the digital forensics team confirmed Carter's suspicions. The Crestwood I-01 device wasn't just accessing Darius's Wi-Fi. It was part of a larger network, a sophisticated surveillance operation targeting multiple homes in the neighborhood. And the source of intrusion? A young man named Brandon Foster, Melanie's nephew, a college student with a penchant for coding and a misguided sense of fun. He'd initially intended it as a prank, a way to peek into his neighbors' lives. But his actions, fueled by unchecked curiosity and a dangerous disregard for privacy, had spiraled into something far more sinister. The revelation hit Melanie like a physical blow. Her nephew, the quiet, unassuming boy she'd practically raised, was responsible for the very thing she'd feared. The shame was a bitter pill to swallow, the realization that her own assumptions had led to this devastating misunderstanding. She had built her suspicions on a foundation of fear and prejudice, and the consequences were now laid bare. Brandon, faced with the evidence, confessed. The arrogance that had fueled his actions had evaporated, replaced by a chilling fear. He hadn't understood the gravity of his actions, the violation of privacy, the potential damage he could have caused. His prank had turned into a nightmare, and he was now trapped in its web. The quiet afternoon in Crestwood had unraveled, revealing a complex tapestry of assumptions, misinterpretations, and the devastating consequences of unchecked surveillance. The digital whispers had turned into a roar, echoing the unsettling truth. Sometimes, the greatest threats are not the ones we expect, but the ones hidden in plain sight, lurking within the very fabric of our communities. The afternoon sun, a hazy gold through the lace curtains, painted stripes across Melanie Foster's kitchen table. Dust motes danced in the golden light, a silent ballet only she seemed to notice. She tapped a manicured nail against the cool, smooth surface of her granite countertop, a nervous rhythm echoing the disquiet in her chest. Outside, a robin perched on the edge of her bird bath, tilting its head as if listening for secrets whispered on the wind. Melanie's gaze, however, remained fixed on the house across the street. Darius Coleman, her new neighbor, was in his front yard again. He wasn't doing anything particularly alarming, not in the traditional sense. He stood there, phone in hand, occasionally glancing upwards at something near his roofline. It was the frequency of these little excursions that had pricked Melanie's suspicion. 3 times this week, she caught him fiddling with something unseen. It was an itch she couldn't scratch, a puzzle piece that refused to fit into her meticulously organized perception of Crestwood. Crestwood was safe, predictable, a place where everyone knew their neighbors and left their doors unlocked, or at least, that was the image Melanie fiercely clung to. She poured herself a glass of iced tea, the clinking of ice against glass momentarily drowning out the internal monologue that had been running on repeat since Tuesday. What was he doing? Why all the secrecy? Is he watching someone? The thought, once formed, refused to dissipate. It coiled in her stomach, a cold knot of unease. She imagined unseen eyes, hidden cameras, a violation of the quiet sanctity of their suburban lives. The robin took flight, its wings a sudden flurry against the backdrop of Darius's still figure. He raised his phone again, and this time, Melanie was sure she saw him manipulating something attached to the eaves. That was it. This wasn't just an eccentric new neighbor. This was something sinister. The iced tea suddenly tasted bitter, mirroring the taste of fear rising in her throat. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the phone. Am I overreacting? Maybe he's just fixing his internet. But why would he do that so often? And why so furtively? The questions tumbled over each other, a cascade of doubt and suspicion. She took a deep breath, the cool air doing little to quell the fire of anxiety in her chest. 911, what's your emergency? The voice on the other end was calm, professional, a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing within Melanie. Yes, I need to report something suspicious, she began, her voice tighter than she intended. It's my neighbor across the street. He's been well. He's outside doing something with his phone, near his roof. It looks off. As the words left her mouth, a strange mix of relief and guilt washed over her. Relief at having finally vocalized her concern, guilt at the possibility of being wrong. What if he's completely innocent? What if I'm making a fool of myself? The thought flitted across her mind, a fleeting shadow against the stark certainty she'd projected just moments ago. The operator on the other end asked for her address, the details of the situation. Melanie recounted what she'd seen, embellishing slightly, the fear magnifying the seemingly innocuous actions. With each word, Darius transformed in her mind, from a quiet, unassuming neighbor to a potential threat, a shadowy figure lurking in the periphery of her perfect world. We'll send a unit to investigate, ma'am. Can you describe the individual? The operator asked. Melanie hesitated. She'd only exchanged a few polite nods with Darius since he'd moved in. He was average height, average build, brown hair. The description felt woefully inadequate, a sketch of a ghost rather than a real person. The realization struck her with a sudden, unsettling clarity. She barely knew the man she was accusing. He's wearing a gray t-shirt and jeans, she added, grasping for details, anything to solidify the image in her mind, to justify the fear that had taken root. As she spoke, she watched Darius retreat back into his house, the front door closing behind him with a quiet click that echoed strangely loud in the sudden stillness of the afternoon. He was gone, vanished behind the closed door, and yet Melanie's anxiety remained, a persistent hum beneath the surface of the everyday. She paced back and forth in her kitchen, the rhythmic click of her heels against the tile floor a counterpoint to the rapid beat of her heart. The robin returned to the birdbath, oblivious to the drama unfolding across the street. Melanie stared at the bird, its cheerful chirping a jarring contrast to the churning thoughts in her head. What have I done? The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. She had set something in motion, a chain of events she couldn't control. And in the quiet of her kitchen, with the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the floor, a seed of doubt began to sprout, whispering insidious questions in the back of her mind. Had she seen what she thought she saw? Or had her own anxieties, her own need for order and control, painted a sinister picture onto a blank canvas? The answer, she knew, lay hidden somewhere in the silence that had fallen over Crestwood, a silence soon to be broken by the approaching sirens. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Darius's driveway, the dappled light playing on the dusty hood of his aging Honda. A faint scent of freshly cut grass hung in the air, a stark contrast to the knot tightening in his stomach. Two police cruisers idled by the curb, their flashing lights painting the scene in alternating strobes of red and blue. He could feel his pulse throbbing in his temples, a steady rhythm against the rising tide of unease. Just changing a password, he thought, the absurdity of the situation swirling in his mind. How did this happen? Two figures emerged from the first cruiser, a man and a woman, both in uniform. The man, broad-shouldered and stern-faced, approached him first, his gaze sharp and assessing. Darius's breath hitched. He swallowed, The dryness in his throat suddenly pronounced. "Don't be nervous," he told himself. "You haven't done anything wrong." But the thought felt hollow, a flimsy shield against the weight of their scrutiny. "Mr. Darius Coleman?" the man asked, his voice a low rumble that carried an undercurrent of authority. Darius nodded, his throat still too tight to speak comfortably. The woman, her expression less severe, remained slightly behind her partner, her eyes scanning the surroundings with an almost unsettling stillness. He found himself fixated on the subtle crease between her brows, a silent question mark etched onto her face. Detective Luis Navarro, the man introduced himself, flashing a badge. "This is Officer Carter." Carter offered a curt nod, her gaze lingering on the router in Darius's hand. Darius's fingers tightened around the plastic casing. The router suddenly felt incriminating, a piece of evidence in a crime he didn't understand. "We got a call about some suspicious activity," Navarro continued, his eyes boring into Darius's. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusation. Darius felt a surge of anger, hot and prickly beneath his skin. Suspicious activity? Changing my Wi-Fi password? He took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. "I'm changing my Wi-Fi password," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "Someone unauthorized was using my network." He gestured towards a router. "That's all." Navarro's expression remained unchanged, his eyes still narrowed in appraisal. "Can you explain why someone would think that's suspicious?" Darius felt a flicker of exasperation. "Because my neighbor is paranoid," he wanted to say, but he bit back the words, sensing that sarcasm wouldn't help his situation. "I don't know," he stammered, a nervous tick tugging at the corner of his lip. "Maybe they saw me outside with the router," and his voice trailed off, the explanation sounding feeble even to his own ears. Just then, a figure hurried towards them, her face etched with a mixture of concern and thinly veiled triumph. Melanie Foster, his neighbor. The knot in Darius's stomach tightened further. He knew, with a sickening certainty, that this was her doing. "Officer," Melanie's voice was shrill, edged with a frantic energy. "I told you. He's been acting strange all day. Out in the yard, fiddling with that device." She pointed a trembling finger at the router in Darius's hand. "I knew something was off." Darius felt a wave of anger wash over him. "Strange? Fiddling? Because I stepped outside for 5 minutes?" He wanted to shout, to defend himself against her ludicrous accusations. But the words seemed to catch in his throat, choked by the sheer absurdity of the situation. Navarro turned to Melanie, his gaze now tinged with a hint of weariness. "Ma'am, can you tell me exactly what you saw?" Melanie launched into a detailed account of Darius's suspicious behavior, her voice escalating with each exaggerated detail. Darius listened in stunned silence, the world around him beginning to feel surreal, distorted. He felt like a character in a poorly written play, trapped in a plot he couldn't comprehend. Officer Carter, who had remained unusually quiet, stepped forward, her gaze still fixed on the router. "May I see that?" she asked, her voice calm and even, a stark contrast to the rising tension. Darius hesitated for a moment, a flicker of resentment flaring within him. "Why should I?" he thought. "I've done nothing wrong." But he knew that refusing would only make things worse. He reluctantly handed her the router. Carter examined it closely, her fingers tracing the contours of the device with an almost clinical detachment. Her silence stretched, taut and heavy, amplifying the buzzing anxiety in Darius's chest. Then, her voice, quiet but clear, cut through the charged atmosphere. "Crestwood I-01, that's interesting." Navarro leaned in, his brow furrowed in question. "What is it, Carter?" "It's the network name," Carter replied, her gaze lifting to meet Darius's. "And it's not just yours, Mr. Coleman. We've been getting reports of similar unauthorized access points popping up all over Crestwood." A cold dread seeped into Darius's bones. He stared at Carter, his mind struggling to process the implications of her words. Unauthorized access points? All over Crestwood? Suddenly, Melanie's accusations, as outlandish as they seemed, took on a chilling new dimension. Navarro turned to Melanie, his expression hardening. Ma'am, does your nephew, Brandon Foster, live with you? Melanie's face paled. The triumphant glint in her eyes flickered and died, replaced by a look of dawning comprehension and a chilling, creeping fear. The scent of freshly cut grass suddenly felt suffocating, a heavy blanket of normalcy smothering the truth that was about to unravel. The afternoon sun cast long, inquisitive fingers through the blinds, striping the beige carpet of Darius's living room. Dust motes danced in the golden light, a silent ballet to the hum of his computer. He watched the two officers, Navarro and Carter, their faces etched with a professional curiosity that felt more like suspicion. An uncomfortable knot tightened in his stomach. This, he thought, was the price of an overly cautious Wi-Fi password change. He'd hoped to deter a freeloading neighbor, not invite the scrutiny of the law. Navarro, his brow furrowed, leaned closer to the router's blinking lights. So, Mr. Coleman, you're saying you noticed an unauthorized device accessing your network? The question hung in the air, thick with implication. Darius could almost taste the metallic tang of distrust. Yes, officer, Darius replied, his voice carefully neutral. He forced himself to maintain eye contact, a small act of defiance against the creeping feeling of being cornered. Just cooperate, he told himself, the words a mantra against the rising tide of anxiety. It's a simple misunderstanding. Officer Carter, her expression less severe than her partner's, tapped at the laptop she carried. Her silence, punctuated only by the click of the keys, felt oddly more unsettling than Navarro's direct questioning. He could sense her observing him, cataloging his every micro-expression, every fidget. They think I'm hiding something, the thought echoed in his mind, cold and sharp. We've identified the device, Carter announced, breaking the strained silence. Her voice, calm and even, held a note of something he couldn't quite decipher. Intrigue? Concern? He wished he knew. And, Navarro prompted, his gaze fixed on Darius. Carter turned the laptop so they could both see the screen. It's identified as Crestwood I-01. Her finger hovered over a line of code. It appears to be accessing camera feeds. A chill snaked down Darius's spine. Camera feeds? His own system had a few strategically placed security cameras, a precaution after a string of break-ins in the neighborhood a year ago. He'd almost forgotten about them. Those are from my security cameras, Darius admitted, the words catching in his throat. He felt a sudden, irrational urge to explain, to justify, to preempt the inevitable wave of suspicion that he knew was about to crash over him. Navarro's eyebrows shot up, his expression hardening. You have security cameras? Yes, Darius repeated, his voice tight. He swallowed, trying to dislodge the lump that had formed his throat. This is getting worse by the second, he thought, the realization a cold weight in his gut. Carter's fingers danced across the keyboard again, the rhythmic tapping filling the silence. There are multiple IP addresses associated with this Crestwood I-01 device, she said, her voice low. And they all seem to be accessing similar feeds. From different locations. The knot in Darius's stomach twisted tighter. Different locations? His mind raced, trying to make sense of her words. This wasn't about a single rogue device leeching off his Wi-Fi. Something far more sinister was at play. Navarro straightened, his eyes now narrowed slits of suspicion. Who owns that device, Mr. Coleman? The question, sharp and accusatory, hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Darius opened his mouth to speak, to deny any knowledge, any involvement, but the words wouldn't come. He knew any denial would sound hollow, even to his own ears. The truth, far more disturbing than any lie he could concoct, was beginning to dawn on him. He shook his head slowly, a wave of nausea washing over him. It's not just my cameras, he managed to say, his voice barely a whisper. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. It's been accessing camera feeds from other houses. In the neighborhood, a sudden commotion from the doorway shattered the tense silence. Melanie Foster stood there, her face pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and disbelief. She'd been lurking in the hallway, eavesdropping, he realized, a fresh wave of unease washing over him. Other houses? She stammered, her voice trembling. What were you talking about? The color drained from her face as the implications of his words sunk in. The carefully constructed facade of neighborly concern crumbled, revealing the raw fear beneath. Her gaze darted between Darius and the officers, her eyes filled with a dawning comprehension that mirrored his own. Navarro and Carter exchanged a significant look. The scope of the investigation had just expanded exponentially. What started as a simple neighborly dispute had morphed into something far more complex, far more unsettling. The quiet, tree-lined streets of Crestwood held a secret, a darkness hidden beneath the veneer of suburban normalcy. And the truth, Darius knew, was far more disturbing than any of them could have imagined. The air in Melanie Foster's living room hung thick with the scent of lemon polish and regret. Sunlight, filtered through the lace curtains, cast long shadows across the floral-patterned carpet, a stark contrast to the storm brewing within her. She wrung her hands, the knuckles bone-white, as Officer Carter and Detective Navarro stood patiently by the doorway. Melanie had led them here, convinced that Darius, her reclusive neighbor, was the source of all the strange occurrences in the neighborhood: flickering lights, intermittent internet outages, that unsettling feeling of being watched. Now, as the silence stretched, a prickly unease began to crawl up her spine. Had she made a mistake? The thought flickered like a faulty bulb, illuminating a dark corner of her mind she'd rather leave unexplored. He's upstairs in his room, Melanie managed, her voice a dry rasp. The lemon polish suddenly felt cloying, suffocating. Navarro nodded, his expression impassive. Please lead the way. Each step on the creaking staircase felt like an accusation. Melanie glanced back at Officer Carter, whose gaze seemed to hold a quiet understanding, a disconcerting depth that made Melanie shift her eyes away. What if she'd been wrong all along? The possibility, once a distant whisper, now roared in her ears, drowning out the rhythmic tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hall. The door to Brandon's room was slightly ajar, a sliver of light escaping into the dim hallway. Melanie pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. Her nephew, Brandon, sat hunched over his computer, bathed in the eerie glow of the monitor. He didn't even turn around. The air in the room was stale, thick with the metallic tang of electronics. Empty energy drink cans littered the desk, a testament to sleepless nights. Melanie's stomach twisted. She hadn't realized how consumed he'd become. Brandon, Melanie began, her voice trembling. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face before he swiveled around. His eyes narrowed, a question in their depths. What is it, Aunt Mel? I'm busy. These officers need to ask you a few questions, Melanie said, her voice barely a whisper. The words felt heavy, let in with a premonition she couldn't quite grasp. Navarro stepped forward, his presence filling the small room. Brandon Foster, we're investigating reports of unauthorized network access and potential surveillance in this neighborhood. We understand you have a keen interest in computer technology. Brandon's eyes flickered, a fleeting shadow of panic crossing his face. He tried to maintain a facade of nonchalance, a smirk playing at the corners of his lips. So, lots of people are into computers these days. Your aunt mentioned you've been spending a lot of time online lately, Officer Carter interjected, her voice soft yet firm. Melanie saw a flicker of something in Brandon's eyes, not defiance, but fear. Melanie watched the interplay, a knot tightening in her chest. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. She had called the police, convinced she was protecting her neighborhood, protecting herself. But what if she had unleashed something far worse? Navarro leaned closer, his gaze unwavering. We've traced some suspicious activity back to this house, Brandon. We need your cooperation. The smirk finally faltered. Brandon's fingers fidgeted with the keyboard, his knuckles white against the black keys. He avoided eye contact, his gaze darting around the room, searching for an escape route that didn't exist. Melanie watched him, her heart sinking. There was a hollowness in his eyes she hadn't seen before, a chilling emptiness. The silence stretched, taut as a wire. Then Brandon's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. He looked up, his eyes meeting Melanie's with a raw vulnerability that made her breath catch in her throat. "It started as a joke," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Melanie's mind raced, trying to grasp the enormity of what he was implying. "A joke? What kind of joke?" "I got curious," Brandon continued, his voice cracking. He swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I figured out how to access the neighborhood security cameras. Then I realized I could get into people's Wi-Fi networks too. Just a prank, you know? See what people were doing, what they were watching." The color drained from Melanie's face. Her breath hitched, a sob rising in her throat. She felt a cold dread creep into her bones, chilling her to the core. Not just the neighbors. He'd been watching her too. "A man-in-the-middle attack," Navarro stated, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Sophisticated for a prank." Brandon flinched, his eyes widening in fear. "I didn't mean for it to get this far," he stammered, his voice rising in pitch. "I just wanted to see. I don't know, I didn't think anyone would find out." Melanie closed her eyes, the weight of his confession crushing her. The lemon scent in the air, once comforting, now felt sickly sweet, a reminder of her naive trust, her blind assumptions. She had suspected Darius, the quiet, unassuming neighbor, while the real threat had been lurking under her own roof, hidden in plain sight. Officer Carter placed a comforting hand on Melanie's shoulder, a silent gesture of understanding that offered little solace. Melanie felt a wave of nausea wash over her, a physical manifestation of the shame and betrayal that gnawed at her insides. "Brandon Foster," Navarro said, his voice sharp, cutting through the tense silence. "You're under arrest for unauthorized network access, violation of privacy, and potential cyberstalking." As Brandon was led away, his face a mask of fear and regret, Melanie stood frozen in the doorway, the echoes of his confession reverberating in the suddenly silent room. The afternoon sunlight, once a symbol of warmth and normalcy, now felt cold and intrusive, exposing the cracks in her carefully constructed world. The quiet hum of the computer, once a sign of Brandon's intellectual pursuits, now sounded like a sinister whisper, a constant reminder of the invisible threads of surveillance that had woven their way through her life, unseen, until now. The lemon-scented air hung heavy, a suffocating reminder of her misplaced suspicions and the devastating consequences of unchecked assumptions. She had sought to expose a phantom threat, only to uncover a far more disturbing truth, a truth that shattered her sense of security and left her standing amidst the ruins of her own making. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Melanie's manicured lawn, the same lawn Darius had admired just hours before, a symbol of suburban tranquility that now felt tainted with a strange, unsettling bitterness. The police cruiser pulled away from the curb, leaving a swirling eddy of dust and a lingering scent of exhaust fumes. Melanie stood rooted to the spot, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, the image of her nephew, Brandon, being led away in handcuffs seared into her mind. How could she have been so wrong? The question echoed in the hollow spaces of her chest, each beat of her heart a painful reminder of her misjudgment. She hadn't just been wrong. She had been catastrophically, irrevocably wrong. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on her, stealing the air from her lungs. Her carefully constructed world of order and predictability had crumbled around her, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. Darius watched her from his own porch, the tension slowly ebbing from his shoulders. He felt a flicker of something akin to satisfaction, a small, vindictive spark in the face of the humiliation he had endured. But even that small ember of triumph couldn't fully extinguish the lingering unease. He'd been targeted, scrutinized, suspected. The injustice of it all gnawed at him. The violation of his privacy, the presumption of guilt, the sheer absurdity of the situation, it left a bitter taste in his mouth. He hadn't done anything wrong. He'd simply changed his Wi-Fi password, a mundane act of digital hygiene that had somehow spiraled into this surreal, Kafkaesque nightmare. Detective Navarro lingered by Darius's steps, a thoughtful crease etched between his brows. He tugged at the knot of his tie, the gesture betraying a lingering discomfort. This case, initially dismissed as a routine neighborly dispute, had unearthed something far more unsettling. The intricate web of surveillance Brandon had woven, the ease with which he had infiltrated the digital lives of his neighbors, it spoke to a chilling disregard for privacy, a disturbing detachment from the consequences of his actions. Navarro had seen it before, the casual arrogance of youth morphing into something far more sinister. This time, thankfully, it had been caught early. But the thought of what might have been lingered, a cold, unsettling premonition. "You were right," Navarro admitted, his voice low and gravelly. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. He met Darius's gaze, a flicker of respect in his eyes. Darius hadn't just been a victim. He had been the unwitting catalyst that had exposed a far greater threat. Darius nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. The detective's admission offered little solace. "Right about what?" he asked, the words tinged with a sardonic edge. "Right about my neighbor being paranoid? Right about there being something more sinister at play?" He paused, the silence stretching taut between them. "I was out here minding my business," he continued, his voice rising with a sudden surge of anger. "And yet somehow, I was the one who got the cops called on me." Navarro shifted his weight, his gaze dropping to the worn wooden planks of the porch. He had no easy answer. The system, flawed and imperfect, had stumbled upon the truth, but not before inflicting its own brand of collateral damage. The weight of that realization settled heavily on his shoulders. He offered a curt nod, a silent acknowledgement of the injustice. Melanie, drawn by their voices, slowly approached. Her steps were hesitant, uncertain. The vibrant color had drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and drawn. The carefully applied makeup couldn't mask the lines of worry etched around her eyes, the trembling of her lips. She stopped a few feet away, her gaze fixed on Darius, a mixture of shame and regret swirling in her depths. "I was wrong," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rustling leaves of the nearby oak tree. The words seemed to catch in her throat, each syllable a struggle. She swallowed hard, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill over. "I made an assumption," she continued, her voice gaining a little strength, "a terrible, awful assumption." The confession hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. She looked at Darius, her eyes pleading for understanding, for forgiveness. Darius met her gaze, his expression unreadable. The anger that had flared moments before now simmered beneath the surface, a slow, controlled burn. He saw the genuine remorse in her eyes, the devastation wrought by her own actions. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that this incident, this unwarranted suspicion, would forever alter the delicate fabric of their neighborly relationship. The unspoken words, the lingering doubts, the invisible barrier erected by mistrust, it would all remain, a constant reminder of the day she had judged him, condemned him, based on nothing more than her own unfounded fears. He wanted to lash out, to unleash the torrent of frustration and resentment that churned within him. But the words wouldn't come. What was there to say? Could any apology truly erase the humiliation, the sense of violation he had endured? He finally looked away, his gaze drifting towards the street, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The beauty of the evening felt incongruous, a stark contrast to the turmoil that raged within him. He took a deep breath, the cool evening air filling his lungs, a small measure of calm amidst the chaos. The silence stretched, heavy and oppressive. The rustling leaves, the chirping crickets, the distant hum of traffic, the sounds of suburbia, once a comforting backdrop, now seemed to amplify the awkwardness, the unspoken tension that hung in the air. This quiet street, this peaceful neighborhood, would forever hold the memory of this day, a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked assumptions, the devastating consequences of a hasty judgment.